Your throat is dry. The sun is directly overhead. There is no river for 100 miles, no lake, no stream, not even a puddle. You are standing in the middle of one of the driest places on earth. And you are not going to die of thirst today. For tens of thousands of years, this was not a hypothetical. This was to stay. Deserts cover about a fifth of the Earth's land surface. No rain for months at a time. Daytime heat that can kill an unprepared person in under 24 hours. And yet humans didn't just survive in places like the Kalahari and the Australian outback. They thrived there, for generation after generation, without a single tap, well pump, or plastic bottle. How? The answer isn't luck. It's knowledge. Deep, inherited, almost unbelievable knowledge about where water hides when it looks like there is none at all. Let's start with the plant that looks like nothing. The summer melon. To an untrained eye, it's just a small striped gourd lying in the sand, easy to miss, easy to step over. But to the sand people of the Kalahari Desert, it was a walking canteen. Crack one open and inside is pale, watery flesh that's over 90% liquid. One melon could provide enough hydration to get a person through an entire day. The anthropologist Richard Lee spent months living with and studying the sand in the 1960s, documenting exactly how much of their diet and hydration came from wild plant foods like this. His fieldwork became one of the most cited studies in all of anthropology. It overturned a popular assumption of the time. The assumption that so-called primitive people lived in constant, desperate scarcity. They didn't. Lee's data showed the sand often worked fewer hours per week gathering food and water than a modern office employee spends commuting. Read that again. Fewer hours than your commute. But melons weren't the whole strategy. There was something far stranger. Sick wells. If you were sand, and you needed water in a place with no visible water at all, you would look for a specific kind of grass, one whose roots reached down toward buried moisture. You dig, sometimes a meter or more, until you hit slightly damp sand. Then you'd insert a hollow reed into that damp patch. And you would suck. Water would rise up the reed, drop by drop, and you would spit it into an empty ostrich eggshell. One person, one reed, one hole in the ground, filling shell after shell after shell. It could take an hour to fill a single eggshell. It didn't matter. Time wasn't the enemy. Dehydration was. Those eggshells weren't just water bottles either. They were buried in the sand at hidden locations across the desert, marked only by memory, forming a kind of invisible water map. A cache system. Emergency backup, planted months in advance, for a future self or a future relative who might pass through their exact patch of nothing and desperately need it. Now travel to a completely different desert, on the other side of the planet. Central Australia. Here, Aboriginal communities develop an entirely different trick, and it's one of the strangest survival techniques ever documented. They drank frogs. Specifically, the water-holding frog, a species that survives the dry season by burrowing underground and encasing itself in a cocoon of shed skin, sealing in moisture for months, sometimes years, waiting for the next rain. Aboriginal trekkers, whose observational skills were extraordinary, learned to read the surface of the sand for the faintest signs of a buried frog. A tiny mound. A slight discoloration. A crack no wider than a fingernail. They dig it up, hold it firmly, and gently squeeze. The frog would release its stored water directly into the person's mouth. Then, and this is the part that tends to shock people, they would return the frog to the ground unharmed, so it could burrow again and store water for the next person who might need it. The ethnographer Donald Thompson, who lived among Aboriginal groups in the early 20th century and documented their survival knowledge in extraordinary detail, described exactly this technique among desert-dwelling communities. It wasn't a myth or a legend. It was a functioning, sustainable water source, reused generation after generation, by people who understood the ecosystem around them at a level modern science is still catching up to. So let's reconstruct a day. Not a Hollywood version. A real one. You wait before sunrise, because the desert punishes anyone who waits too long. The air is briefly cool. You check the seat well your grandmother showed you as a child, the one hidden near a particular clump of bunch grass tree ridge lines from camp. You refill your eggshells. You scan the ground the way you were taught, not for danger, but for the subtle signs of buried moisture. A slightly different color of sand here. A cluster of specific plants there. By midday, when the heat becomes dangerous, you are not wandering aimlessly. You are moving with purpose between known points on a mental map passed down over hundreds of generations, a map with no lines on paper, stored entirely in memory and story. This is the part that should stop you. This wasn't improvisation. It was a system. Precise, tested, and reliable enough that entire populations depended on it for their entire lives. Here's the twist, though, the part that flips the whole story on its head. We tend to imagine ancient desert life as a constant battle against scarcity, a grim struggle just to not die of thirst. But the trekking researcher Louis Liebenberg, who spent decades studying sand hunting and survival skills in the Kalahari, found something different. He found that mastery, not desperation, defined this life. Reading tracks, reading plants, reading the subtle language of sand and shadow, this wasn't panic. It was expertise, refined over a lifetime, passed down with pride. The people who lived in the world's harshest deserts weren't the ones barely scraping by. In many ways, they understood their environment with a precision most of us, surrounded by supermarkets and tap water, will never come close to. And that's the mirror. You live in a world where water arrives instantly. Turn a handle, and it appears. You've probably never once had to think about where it comes from, or what would happen if it simply stopped. Your ancestors' entire survival depended on a form of attention you've likely never had to develop. Not because you're less capable. Because you've never needed to be. That knowledge didn't vanish because it stopped mattering. It vanished because convenience made it unnecessary. Somewhere in your evolutionary past, someone could read a landscape the way you read a phone screen, instantly, instinctively, and correctly, because their life depended on it. Your throat is dry. The sun is directly overhead. But this time you're not in the desert. You're somewhere with air conditioning, and water 20 feet away in a bottle you didn't have to dig for, track, or wait an hour to fill. And maybe, for just a second, that's worth noticing.